So I did my part, Elvis did his show, and we were lucky. Great talent, and we had a great show and a lot of fun. And we had a great relationship, but I took care of mine, he took care of his, and he...
Think about what it means to be the most famous human being on the planet. Not just popular, but the kind of famous where your name alone stops conversations in languages you don't even speak. Where teenagers in Tokyo know your face before they know their own country's leaders. Where farmers in rural England and fishermen in coastal Australia and schoolgirls in Buenos Aires all share one common dream: to be in the same room as you, just once, just for one night, to feel what it's like to breathe the same air as a living legend. That was Elvis Presley. Not metaphorically, not with asterisks or qualifications. Elvis was, by the mid-1960s, the single most recognized entertainer on the face of the earth. His records didn't just sell, they detonated. His movies didn't just screen, they flooded theaters on every continent. Radio stations from Manchester to Melbourne played his music with a kind of reverence usually reserved for something holy. The world didn't just know Elvis. The world was obsessed with Elvis in a way that we haven't seen before or since. And Elvis Presley, in his entire career, across 30 years of performing, recording, and redefining what popular music even meant, never once set foot on an international stage. Not London, not Paris, not Rome, not Tokyo, not Sydney, not Dublin, not Berlin, not a single performance outside of North America, ever. Let that settle for a moment, because it should disturb you. It should feel wrong, because it is wrong. It was always wrong. And somewhere beneath the glittering surface of his Las Vegas residencies and his Hollywood film sets and his sold-out American arenas, Elvis Presley knew it was wrong too. There are letters. Private ones, notes passed between Elvis and his closest friends, members of the Memphis Mafia, the tight inner circle that surrounded him through most of his adult life, where Elvis talked about wanting to see the world. Not in a casual, offhand way, in a desperate way. In the way a man talks about something he wants so badly, it physically hurts to think about. He wanted to stand on a stage in London and look out at a crowd of British fans who had grown up with his music the same way American kids had. He wanted Tokyo. He wanted Europe. He wanted to know what it felt like when the rest of the world, the part that could never reach him, finally got to reach back. It never happened, and for decades, the official explanation was vague enough to go unchallenged. Scheduling conflicts, film commitments, the complexity of international logistics. Colonel Parker, his manager, always had a reason. Always had a deflection. Always had a way of making it sound like the international tours were simply delayed, coming soon, almost confirmed, just a little more time needed. The tours never came. The reasons kept changing. And Elvis kept performing the same American stages while the rest of the planet waited. But here's what you need to understand about Colonel Tom Parker before this story can mean what it's actually supposed to mean. Parker wasn't just a manager in the traditional sense, some suit in an office negotiating contracts and booking venues. Parker was a force, a gravitational pull, a man who had built himself from absolute nothing into one of the most powerful figures in entertainment history through sheer audacity, psychological manipulation, and an almost supernatural instinct for control. He had taken a young truck driver from Memphis and turned him into a god. And in doing so, Parker had made himself untouchable, because you can't remove the man who built the throne without risking the throne itself. Elvis understood that. Parker made sure of it. Their relationship was the kind that doesn't have a clean name. It wasn't friendship, though there were genuine moments of warmth. It wasn't purely business, though money was always at the center of it. It was something closer to dependency, the kind that grows so slowly, so quietly, that by the time you realize how deep it goes, you're already too far in to find your way back out. Parker needed Elvis's talent to survive, Elvis needed Parker's machinery to function. And somewhere in the machinery, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The international tours weren't delayed. They weren't complicated. They weren't stuck in some logistical holding pattern that Parker was quietly working to resolve. They were blocked, deliberately, systematically, and with a level of calculated precision that only becomes visible once you understand what Parker was actually protecting. Because Colonel Tom Parker had a secret, not a small one, not the kind of secret that embarrasses you at a dinner party, the kind of secret that, if it ever came to light, could destroy everything he had spent his entire life building: his identity, his career, his freedom, and his carefully constructed version of the American dream. And the only way to keep that secret buried was to make absolutely certain that Elvis Presley, the most famous man in the world, never left the country. So why? What was Parker hiding that was so enormous, so catastrophic, that he was willing to sacrifice the global legacy of the greatest entertainer who ever lived just to keep it in the dark? The answer is more shocking than you're ready for. And once you hear it, you will never look at Colonel Parker, or Elvis, the same way again. His name wasn't Colonel Tom Parker. That's where this story actually begins, not in Memphis, not in Las Vegas, not in any of the glittering American landscapes that Parker spent his life carefully constructing as the backdrop to his legend. It begins in a small city in the southern Netherlands, in a modest working-class household, where a boy named Andreas Cornelis van Kuyk was born in 1909. A Dutch boy, a European boy, a boy who would one day cross an ocean, erase his own identity, and build an entirely new human being from scratch, one so convincing, so thoroughly American, that the entire entertainment industry would spend decades never thinking to question it. Parker didn't immigrate to the United States through any official channel. There was no paperwork, no legal process, no record of entry. Somewhere in the late 1920s, Andreas van Kuyk simply appeared on American soil, and Tom Parker began. The carnival circuit, the traveling shows, the relentless, scrappy hustle of a man who had nothing but nerve and an almost frightening ability to read people and bend situations to his will. He reinvented himself so completely that even people who worked closely with him for years had no idea they were looking at a man who technically didn't exist within the American legal system. The colonel title came later, a ceremonial honor granted by a Tennessee governor, the kind that carries no military rank, no formal weight, nothing but the word itself. Parker took it and wore it like armor, because that's what men like Parker do. They find the thing that makes them sound legitimate, and they never let go of it. But here is the detail that changes everything. Here is the crack in the foundation that the entire empire was built on top of. Colonel Tom Parker, the most powerful manager in the history of American entertainment, never obtained a United States passport. Not once. Not ever. In all the decades he spent controlling Elvis's career, negotiating his contracts, collecting his percentages, and positioning himself as the ultimate insider of the American music industry, Parker never held the one document that would have allowed him to leave the country and come back. And the reason he didn't get one isn't complicated. It's just devastating. Because the moment Parker walked into a government office and applied for a passport, the questions would start. Where were you born? What is your legal name? When did you enter this country? And Parker had no safe answers to any of those questions. The application process would have triggered exactly the kind of federal scrutiny that his entire constructed life was designed to avoid. There was a real, documented, legally grounded possibility that if Tom Parker ever left the United States, if he stepped onto foreign soil for any reason, including to accompany his most famous client on an international tour, he might be flagged on re-entry, investigated, exposed, and potentially deported to a country he hadn't seen in decades, under a name he had spent his entire adult life pretending wasn't his. So he made a decision. A cold, calculated, utterly ruthless decision. If he couldn't leave, Elvis wouldn't leave either. What makes this so staggering isn't just the selfishness of it, though the selfishness is breathtaking. It's the architecture of how Parker pulled it off. Because he didn't simply say no to international tours and leave it at that. He built an entire professional reality around Elvis that made the international tours seem unnecessary, impractical, or already in the planning stages. He kept Elvis buried in film contracts that locked up his schedule. He leaned into the Las Vegas residency model at a time when Vegas was considered a step down for an artist of Elvis's caliber. But it was controllable, domestic, and it kept the money flowing without requiring anyone to board a plane to London. He negotiated deals that paid Elvis well enough that the question of what he might be leaving on the table never became urgent enough to force a real confrontation. And when promoters came, and they did come, repeatedly with serious international offers, legitimate proposals from major venues across Europe and Asia, Parker either killed the deals quietly or quoted fees so astronomically inflated that the offers collapsed under their own weight. He wasn't protecting Elvis's brand. He wasn't protecting Elvis's schedule. He was protecting himself. Every single time. The people closest to Elvis saw the pattern. Members of his inner circle have spoken in interviews about how Parker would shut down international conversations with a speed and a finality that felt disproportionate, almost panicked, though Parker was too controlled to let it look like panic. There was always a reason ready, always an explanation that sounded logical on the surface. And for years, it worked, because Parker was dealing with someone who trusted him completely. Someone who had been conditioned since the age of 21 to believe that Colonel Parker's judgment was the foundation everything else rested on. That conditioning wasn't accidental. It was Parker's greatest and most sinister achievement. Not the deals he made, not the money he generated, but the way he made Elvis Presley feel that without Colonel Tom Parker, there was no Elvis Presley at all. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. But here's what nobody talks about. Parker didn't just protect himself. He built an entire system, an entire career around making sure Elvis never had a real reason to question why the world's biggest star was the only one forbidden from seeing the world. And that system? It cost Elvis more than anyone ever calculated. There is a version of Elvis Presley's career that never happened. A version where the stages were in London and Paris and Tokyo, where the crowd spoke different languages but sang every word in perfect unison, where Elvis walked out under foreign lights and felt, maybe for the first time in years, like the world was genuinely, completely his. That version of his career was real enough to be planned, real enough to be dreamed about, real enough that promoters across 3 continents spent years trying to make it happen. And it was stolen from him. Not by circumstance, not by bad luck, but by one man's secret, dressed up as management strategy. The financial reality alone is enough to make you sick. By the mid-1960s, international touring had become the single most lucrative frontier in the music industry. The Beatles weren't just conquering America, they were circling the globe, playing to audiences in countries that had never seen anything like them, generating revenue streams that multiplied with every time zone they crossed. The Rolling Stones. Tom Jones. Artists a fraction of Elvis's stature were banking millions from European and Asian tours while Elvis sat stationary, locked into a Las Vegas contract that paid him well, but paid Parker better, and cost both of them something that money alone could never fully measure. Music historians and industry analysts who have studied this period estimate that Elvis left somewhere between $200 and $300 million in international touring revenue uncollected across his career. That number isn't speculation. It's a conservative reconstruction based on his domestic draw and the global demand that never got a legitimate outlet. The money went elsewhere, into Vegas residencies, into film deals, into the kind of controlled, predictable income streams that suited Parker's needs perfectly and Elvis's creative soul not at all. But the financial loss, as staggering as it is, isn't the deepest wound. The deepest wound is what the confinement did to Elvis as an artist and as a human being. Because Elvis Presley was never just an entertainer in the shallow sense of the word. He was a genuinely, profoundly gifted musician with a range of influences and ambitions that most people never got to see. Because Parker spent 2 decades carefully managing which version of Elvis the public was allowed to access. Elvis wanted to record serious gospel albums, full, committed projects that reflected the music he had grown up with and never stopped loving. He wanted to explore his roots. He wanted the kind of creative freedom that comes when an artist is secure enough in their own power to take real risks. Parker didn't want risks. Parker wanted control. And so, instead of artistic evolution, Elvis got a conveyor belt of formulaic Hollywood films, 31 of them, most of which he personally despised, cranked out at a pace that left no room for the music that actually mattered to him. People who were in the room with Elvis during this period, band members, close friends, members of the inner circle who have spoken candidly in the years since, describe a man who was slowly, quietly suffocating. Not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines at the time, but in the way that happens when someone extraordinarily alive is placed in a situation that keeps getting smaller. Priscilla Presley has spoken about the isolation, about how Graceland, which should have been a sanctuary, began to feel like the outer wall of a world that kept contracting. The people around Elvis noticed the way his eyes lit up when international fans somehow reached him, letters, gifts, stories passed through intermediaries, and how quickly that light faded when the reality of his situation reasserted itself. The pills came into that space. The weight came into that space. The long, shapeless days at Graceland, the nocturnal schedule, the growing dependence on the people around him because the world outside had been quietly taken away, all of it grew in the vacuum that Parker's control had created. This is not a simple equation, and it would be dishonest to draw a single straight line between Parker's secret and Elvis's decline. Elvis's struggles were complex, layered, and shaped by forces that went beyond any one person's decisions. But it is absolutely fair, and it is supported by the testimony of the people who loved him, to say that the cage Parker built accelerated everything. That the creative suffocation fed the emotional isolation. That the emotional isolation fed the dependence. And that the dependence fed the decline in a cycle that nobody around Elvis had enough power or courage to fully interrupt. What cuts the deepest when you sit with all of it is the longing. The specific, undeniable, heartbreaking longing that Elvis carried for a version of his life that was always just slightly out of reach. He talked about England. He talked about what it would feel like to perform for the fans who had waited the longest, who had loved him from the greatest distance. There are accounts of Elvis standing in Graceland late at night, listening to recordings of his own concerts, and talking about wanting more. Not more fame, not more money, but more world, more life. More of the thing that performing was supposed to give you, which is the feeling of genuine, unfiltered human connection with people who have traveled from somewhere real to be in your presence. Parker took that from him. Every single night of every single year that Elvis spent inside the borders of one country, while the rest of the planet pressed its face against the glass. And Parker kept smiling, kept collecting, and kept his secret buried until it wasn't. Here is the question that has haunted Elvis scholars, biographers, and devoted fans for decades. the one that sits at the center of this entire story like a wound that never fully closed. Did Elvis know? Did he ever look across the table at Colonel Tom Parker and understand, on some fundamental level, that the man controlling his career wasn't just making business decisions, but was actively, deliberately sacrificing Elvis's global legacy to protect a secret that had nothing to do with Elvis at all? The answer, when you follow the evidence carefully, is both more complicated and more devastating than a simple yes or no. There were moments, documented, corroborated moments, where Elvis came dangerously close to the truth. People inside his circle have described conversations where Elvis expressed frustration about Parker that went beyond the usual tensions between an artist and his manager. Frustration that felt specific. Targeted, like a man who senses he is being lied to, but cannot locate the lie precisely enough to confront it directly. Jerry Schilling, one of Elvis's closest and most trusted friends, has spoken about the way Elvis would occasionally erupt about Parker in private. Not with the vague annoyance of someone unhappy with a contract negotiation, but with something raw. Something that sounded like betrayal without being able to name itself as betrayal yet. Elvis threatened to fire Parker more than once. This is documented. These weren't casual, heat-of-the-moment outbursts. They were serious enough that people around Elvis took them seriously, held their breath, and waited to see if the relationship that had defined everything was finally about to fracture. And every single time, Parker found a way back in. Sometimes through charm. Sometimes through financial leverage, reminding Elvis of how deeply their business affairs had become entangled, how much disruption a split would cause, how much Elvis stood to lose in the short term if he walked away. And sometimes, according to people who witnessed these moments, through something that looked uncomfortably close to emotional manipulation. Parker knew exactly which levers to pull. He had spent decades installing them. The codependency had grown so total, so structurally embedded in every aspect of Elvis's professional life, that even when Elvis saw the bars of his cage clearly, and there were moments when he saw them, he couldn't bring himself to walk out. Because Parker hadn't just managed Elvis's career. He had made himself load-bearing. He had positioned himself so deeply inside the architecture of everything Elvis had built that removing him felt, at least from inside the situation, like it might bring the whole structure down. That's not an accident. That's the most sophisticated form of control there is. The kind where the person being controlled genuinely cannot tell where the control ends and their own choices begin. Then, Elvis died. There were conversations happening in the weeks and months after his death, among family members. Among members of his inner circle, that reflected a quiet but persistent discomfort with the conclusions they had been handed. A feeling that something hadn't been fully examined. A feeling that the investigation had been, in some unspoken way, guided toward a particular destination rather than allowed to arrive at one naturally. And then there were the records themselves. The sealed files. The restricted access. The documentation that should have been a matter of public medical record in a high-profile death investigation, but instead became something that required legal navigation just to approach. Families of ordinary people don't seal medical records after a sudden death. Coroners' offices don't routinely restrict access to findings in cases where the conclusion is clean and uncomplicated. Sealing happens when there is something to protect. The only question, the question this video is going to spend the next several minutes answering, is what exactly needed protecting, and who needed it protected from. Because what emerged in the years after Elvis's death, slowly, through investigative reporting and independent forensic review and the testimony of people who were inside that investigation, painted a picture that looked almost nothing like the one the public had been given. A picture that involved not just the drugs in his system, but the people who put them there, the institutions that looked away, and the documents that were quietly ensured would never tell the full story on their own. The toxicology report, the prescription records, the sealed communications. They were all pointing somewhere. And the official conclusion, delivered before the evidence was complete, was designed to make sure nobody followed the direction they were pointing. That story starts right now. When the full toxicology results finally came back, they didn't whisper. They screamed. And the people who were supposed to be listening, the officials, the gatekeepers, the medical authority figures entrusted with delivering the truth to the public, chose, in that moment, to turn the volume down. What the Baptist Memorial Hospital laboratory found inside Elvis Presley's body was not the profile of a man who died from a heart that simply stopped. It was the chemical portrait of a system that had been pushed, medicated, and overwhelmed to a degree that most physicians today describe as staggering. Not one drug. Not two. Not the kind of modest prescription presence that might reasonably sit alongside a cardiac explanation without raising questions. The toxicology screen came back positive for 14 different substances. 14. A man who, just months before his death, had undergone a medical evaluation that, by most accounts, did not flag him as someone in immediate mortal danger. A man who, by all outward appearances, still had years left to perform, to record, to exist. And yet the official conclusion landed with remarkable speed, remarkable certainty, and a remarkable lack of the kind of public scrutiny that a death of this magnitude should have generated. That speed is important, because here is where the record begins to crack. August 16th, 1977. And the secret that Parker had spent his entire life protecting began, slowly and then all at once, to come apart. In 1981, a Louisiana probate court launched a formal investigation into Colonel Parker's management of Elvis's estate, specifically examining whether Parker's contractual arrangements with Elvis had been ethical or whether they had constituted a profound conflict of interest. What the investigation uncovered confirmed what the people closest to Elvis had long suspected. Parker had been taking commissions of up to 50% of Elvis's earnings, an almost unheard of figure in the industry. One that no legitimate manager operating in his client's best interest could justify. The investigation also began pulling on the threads of Parker's identity, and what unraveled was the full picture of Andreas van Kuyk, the Dutch immigrant, the undocumented entry, the manufactured American life. The truth that had been buried for 50 years finally had a name and a paper trail attached to it. Biographers who spent years reconstructing Parker's origins confirmed the core facts. He had entered the United States illegally. He had never held a passport. He had constructed an identity so thoroughly fictional that even the people who trusted him most had been living inside his fabrication without knowing it. And Elvis Presley, the man whose entire international career had been sacrificed on the altar of that fabrication, had never been told the real reason why the world was being kept just out of his reach. Think about what that means. Think about every fan in London who saved up for a ticket to a show that was always almost announced and never actually came. Think about the crowds in Tokyo and Sydney and Paris who grew old waiting. Think about the musicians and promoters and venue owners across 3 continents who spent years trying to get Elvis on their stages and kept hitting a wall they couldn't see and couldn't understand. Every single one of them was a casualty of one man's secret. Every single one of them paid a price for a lie they never knew existed. And Elvis paid the highest price of all. Not just in money, not just in creative freedom, but in the slow, grinding, invisible cost of being the most famous person in the world and somehow still feeling like the walls were getting closer. He deserved the world. He had earned the world in a way that very few human beings in the history of entertainment ever have. And Colonel Tom Parker, desperate, brilliant, and utterly terrified of the truth catching up with him, made sure the world never got to give it back. That's not a music industry story. That's not a business cautionary tale. That's a tragedy. A real one. The kind that doesn't resolve neatly doesn't offer a lesson that makes the loss feel worth it, and doesn't let the man responsible off the hook just because he's been gone long enough for history to soften the edges. Elvis carried this with him every single day, to the very end. If this story hit you the way it hit me, share it with someone who needs to hear the real truth about Elvis and Colonel Parker. Subscribe if you haven't already, drop your reaction in the comments below, and stay close, because the next Elvis story we're covering is even darker than this one.